Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming back. It's always a good sign. It's now time for our plenary session, which tackles an important and often challenging topic, toxicity in charities. Toxic environments can undermine volunteer well-being, disrupt engagement and create frustrations for leaders. Left unaddressed, they can weaken an organisation's mission and damage the volunteer experience. So in this session, Martin J. Cowling, a globally recognised expert in volunteerism, will share practical insights and real-world examples to help us identify signs of toxicity and transform these challenges into opportunities for creating thriving, positive ecosystems. Facilitating this interactive discussion for us is our good friend and HVG colleague, Rob Jackson, Director of Rob Jackson Consulting. Together, Martin and Rob will bring their wealth of expertise and international travel experience to offer actionable strategies for fostering healthier environments where volunteers feel valued and motivated. So please join me in welcoming Martin and Rob to the virtual stage. Over to you, chaps.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today. My job is literally to be question wrangler when that time comes. So I'm going to very briefly introduce my very good friend and colleague, Martin Cowling, Martin J. Cowling. Martin and I have known each other for at least 20 years or so now. We've worked together on multiple occasions. And those of you in Wales may have seen us last year or earlier this year, even when we did a travel tour around for WCVA and the Welsh Government. Our mutual colleague and friend Susan J. Ellis always used to say an expert is anybody with a briefcase from more than 30 miles away. Martin's from Australia and currently based in Bangkok, so he really knows his stuff. So I'm going to shut up, let Martin do his thing. And if you've got questions, please do throw them into the chat or hang on to them until we come to the Q&A at the end, at which point you can unmute yourself and ask away. So over to Martin.
Thanks, Rob. Good day, everybody. This is going to be a lightning plenary because this is actually 4 hours of material that I'm squeezing into a very short period of time. Just a bit about my interest. I work in change, leadership and impact, and I generally work with two sorts of organisations. The first are organisations that are doing very well and are needing to look at positive change. And the second are organisations that I politely call basket cases, where things are really, really awful and they need rescuing before they blow each other up, tear each other apart or go bankrupt. This year I've worked across 11 countries, 11 nations, including Wales. And I'm passionate about volunteering and volunteerism. I'm passionate about people and a better world. And I'm concerned currently about the dark side of volunteering. And I had this weird experience at the moment where I go to a lot of, particularly around International Volunteer Day and International Volunteer Managers Day, I go to these workshops where everybody, or these sessions, or these thank you events where people are like, oh, volunteers are wonderful, volunteers are amazing. We couldn't do anything without volunteers, aren't they wonderful? And then simultaneously, I'm working with organizations that are actually toxic volunteering organizations. So it's kind of this weird experience at the moment. I'm writing a book at the moment, due out in May 2025, looking at toxicity in organizations. And I have a blog post currently on Rob's blog, The Hidden Side of Volunteering, Addressing Toxicity in Volunteering Organisations. You will get a copy of these slides and you will be able to link through to that blog post and have a read of it. And I'd love your feedback on it. I'm seeing three main patterns in terms of what I'm wanting to talk about today. The first is what I call volunteer on volunteer. And this is where volunteers are actually creating a terrible environment or organisation for other volunteers. The second are volunteers to leadership. And the third is leadership to volunteers. And leadership could be paid or it could be other volunteers. I also have seen trustee to employee conflicts. And remember, trustees are usually volunteers and people forget that. Often trustees forget their volunteers, but I have seen situations where trustees treat employees really, really badly. And also where trustees actually tear each other apart. These are actually less common these days because I'm actually seeing people manage their trustees in a much better way. What I'd like you to do right now, just for a moment, is to drop into the chat which of those which of those things have you seen? 1, volunteer to volunteer. 2, volunteer to leadership of an organization. Or 3, leadership to volunteer, where the behaviors are negative towards those particular groups. So have you seen volunteer to volunteer? Volunteer, Emma, thank you, all 3. A lot of people, all of them. It's a bit exciting and a bit depressing, isn't it? Thank you for sharing those. I really appreciate it immensely. Just give me 10 seconds to go back to the Zoom. Still seeing the chat. Thank you. That's all very depressing and exciting. That's very interesting. Thank you for that. So I want to talk a bit about what we see and what it looks like. And there are 9 things, 9 common patterns that we see. And the first is, in every situation, there has been ineffective leadership. Either a history of ineffective leadership, or an ineffective leader, or an ineffective CEO, or an ineffective volunteer manager, whatever title you want to call that person. There has been a period or an event where there has been an ineffective leader. And as soon as you have that situation, we see the toxicity develop within an organization. And often that toxicity results in ineffective leadership, and it starts to form a loop. So you have this ineffective leadership that caused the toxicity causes the ineffective leadership, and many organizations then end up in this spiral. And I'm seeing some people nodding their heads. I'm assuming that's because you've seen the same experience. It's not because someone's offered you a cup of tea. The second thing that is common in these organizations is poor communication every single time. And it's interesting because people say to me, I told people this and they didn't hear it. The reality is that if you want volunteers to hear a consistent message, you actually have to repeat it 6 or 7 times. You can't rely on the one message. And some of you know that already, and some of you are nodding because you've seen that. And in these situations, poor communication is allowed to develop, messages aren't released or shared, and people don't hear positive messages. They only hear negative messages. The third thing that I see in these organizations is a blame culture. One of the things that I did was I asked people for examples of toxic organizations. And in 24 hours after I asked, I got 168 examples of toxic organizations. In 1 week, I got 500 examples. In my book has 10 chapters. I am not putting 50 examples in every chapter. But the sad reality is this is a side of volunteerism we don't talk about. I have been working with an organization, a homelessness charity, where the founder was dismissed for inappropriate conduct. The impact of his sudden dismissal and the revelation of his inappropriate behavior, it turned out that he had been inappropriately behaving, and you can interpret that as what it means, with clients and female members of staff for 2 decades. The volunteers had split into 3 groups when I arrived. Group 1 consisted of long-standing volunteers who believed passionately that the founder had been unfairly dismissed, had been framed and misunderstood, believed in his cause and believed in him and would hear no wrong about him. The second group hated the founder, felt betrayed by him. And the third group were the new volunteers that had come in since the founder had been dismissed and quickly found themselves bewildered and overwhelmed by this toxic environment. And they were pressured to take sides, and often they would leave very, very quickly. But one of the things that I encountered was a massive blame culture. These 3 groups couldn't sit in the same room together before someone would start blaming someone else. And they would blame them for everything, for issues stretching back over 20 years. And I've been trying to tackle that blame culture. The third is favoritism and inequity. And we see this with all sorts of in-groups, out-groups. You can have leaders that have an in-group. You can have a group of volunteers that are the in-group and another group that can be the out-group. We see inequity. We see treatment of others in a negative way. I've seen organizations where the men dominate the organization and the women are the outgroup. I've seen organizations where people from a culturally and linguistically different background are the outgroup. I even worked in one organization where gay men were the in-group and lesbian women and straight men were the out-group. And we had to work together in that organization to overcome that division and inequity in that toxic organization. These organizations have a very significant characteristic: massive resistance to change. The volunteers are resistant to change. The paid staff are resistant to change. The organization is resistant to change. And often it's caught up in this toxicity and people trying to hang on to something. They do everything they can to resist change. I did a change process for an organization, started in June, met with 64 volunteers, and every volunteer started off the one-to-one meeting with me by saying, "We don't want to hear, go home. We don't want to change, go home." That was a great start. I would like to say that at the end of the process, 81% of them agreed with 95% of the change recommendations. So we came a long way in 6 months. Lack of development. We see in these organisations a significant lack of development or a lack of interest in development. Volunteers will say, "I don't need development, I don't need training, I don't need to be changed. I'm happy with the way things are." Even though they say it's horrible working here, I don't like it, they still don't want to invest in that development. Obviously, in these cultures, there's this very low morale, and people are often in denial of that low morale or very proud of that low morale. And very high turnover. What's interesting is often the high turnover is not in the core volunteer pool. They will hang on. It will be in the new volunteers who last a very, very short period of time. The other thing we see, obviously, and it's not a surprise to anyone, poor performance. So the organisation doesn't actually manage to work effectively. So one of the organisations I've been working with, in fact, the one I mentioned where there were 3 groups, the CEO said to me, it's like an abusive marriage, the way the 3 groups have worked. The government had actually withdrawn its funding for that charity because the clients were complaining about the way they were treated because it was highly toxic. I was doing some work with an organisation, just jumping back to resistance to change, where I was asked to help with a change process. It was with a charity that had charity shops. And all the charity shops were run by local groups of volunteers within their village or their town or their community. And those volunteers had every decision about those local shops. Now, aging volunteers, changing occupational health and safety rules, changing fundraising rules meant that the national office of the organisation integrated all of those shops into a national program. The volunteer coordinator tasked with doing this job actually left the organisation diagnosed with PTSD because of the way that some of the volunteers reacted and their toxic culture. She received death threats from volunteers who said, "How dare you destroy our shop?" On one visit, she went to a shop and she found that her car handles had been smeared with dog excrement, dog poo. And so she found every door handle was covered with this dog excrement with a message saying, "Go home, we don't want you." They were very resistant to change. And obviously, back to the poor performance, the 9th thing we see is a lack of trust. So we see ineffective leadership, poor communication, a blame culture, favoritism, inequity, resistant to change, lack of development, low morale, and high turnover, poor performance, and lack of trust. If you're looking at those and going, "Oh my goodness, my organisation has all 9, it's probably time you gave me a call for some cup of tea counselling." If you have 4 or 5 of them, you probably need to have some serious discussions. What do we do about these things? Well, you can do what many organisations do and leave them and just carry on and pretend it's not happening, or you can face reality. And my suggestion, pathways to transformation, there are 8 things I encourage organisations to do. First, recognise the problem. Recognise there is a real issue. So many organisations pretend there isn't, or because it's volunteers, it doesn't matter, or we're going to keep on soldering on. And I met volunteers who say, there isn't a problem, we don't need to change things. Recognise the problem and help your teams understand there is a real problem. The second is there's not an easy way out. You have to actually develop a plan, a strategy. And part of your strategy for your volunteerism and your volunteer is to develop a plan towards transformation. And I try and do that plan with key volunteers from across the organization to try and build that, and then encourage the employees and the management to be part of developing a plan together. Because if the plan just sits with a volunteer coordinator, it's not going to be as successful. So you need to have a plan where everybody's involved. I also try and start to build leaders across the organization, across the different factions, to try and build a group of people that are going to support the change process across the organization. And sometimes you get people who are very willing to be involved, and you get other people that halfway through the change process actually sabotage you. And that's very depressing, but is actually a reality. We need to be providing support to the people that are being undermined or struggling in this, but we don't provide support to the bullies. And one of the things that I find very interesting in many organizations, in a way of trying to subvert people who are bullying or being negative, they actually build those people up. I went to one organization and they said, "We have a problem." And I said, "What's that?" And they said, "We have a volunteer from hell who makes our lives hell. And we struggle with her. She interferes in everything. She's bullying, she's undermining, she's negative." And I said, "What did you do about it?" And they looked at me and they said, "We made her volunteer of the year." I said, "You did that because you thought if you made her volunteer of the year, she would miraculously become a nice person. And she would suddenly stop bullying other people, and she would say, 'I'm volunteer of the year. I'm going to be nice and cooperative.'" And they said, "Yes." I said, "What's really happened?" And they said, "She's taken even more control. She now demands things and says, 'I'm volunteer of the year. You do what I say. I'm volunteer of the year. This is not the way we do things.'" Provide support to those who need support, not the bullies. Over communicate. As I mentioned before, if you're going to get messages out, you need to do it 6 or 7 times. Over communicate the message again and again about where you're moving towards, the standards of behavior you're looking for, what is actually happening to get there, what is happening with every stage of the process. The 6th thing I encourage organizations to do is to set expectations. We have volunteer codes of behavior coming out of our ears, but often we fail to enforce those in a positive way. We need to find ways of actually setting expectations in a positive way, not just using the stick, but using the carrot to help people to actually look at their own behaviors and to look at those. And then what I call remove the rot. If you have a bullying volunteer, if you have a volunteer that's negative, if you have a volunteer that's undermining, or a group of volunteers, you have to remove them. And you either remove them from the organization or you remove them from the program. I had one volunteer that we called the volunteer from hell. Her name was Margaret, and she was a very lonely, sad woman whose only outlet was volunteering in our program. We did a volunteer review, and every volunteer that worked with her on a Thursday said, "I will leave because," and they named Margaret. Margaret's life was bound up in volunteering for my organization. So what did I do? I said to Margaret, "Would you like to move?" By the way, Margaret's not a real name. You've probably worked that out. I said to Margaret, "Would you like to volunteer on Fridays?" She said, "I'd love to volunteer on Fridays." So I moved Margaret to Fridays. After 3 weeks, Margaret said to me, "I love Fridays." I said, "Why is that?" She said, "Because there's no other volunteers here. I'm the only volunteer rostered on a Friday." I said, "Yes, that's right." I removed the rot from Thursdays, but I didn't remove Margaret from the organisation. Somehow you have to remove the rot, and sometimes it means making difficult decisions. One of my organisations, the biggest donor in the organisation's wife was my volunteer from hell. I had to remove the biggest donor's wife from the organisation when the CEO had said to me, "Do not lose this volunteer because I do not want to lose our donor." So I had to find a way of removing the rot in a way that was dignified for everybody. But if I left her there, that organisation would continue to burn through volunteers and other potential donors. The other thing is follow the rules. You must follow the rules and you must show that you're following the rules. If there's a discipline process, follow the discipline process. If a board trustee can only stay on a board for 3 years, they can only stay on a board for 3 years. Every time organizations are in trouble, it's because they've bent the rules. I've met organizations that go, we didn't reference check that volunteer because we wanted to get them in quickly. We bent the rules. As a result, we have a volunteer from hell. We skipped the training for this volunteer because of X, Y, and Z, and now we have a problem. Follow the rules. I've met organizations where they've had the same head of the board for 9 years. As a result, they have developed a toxic volunteer culture because of that person, because they failed to follow the rules. I want to say very quickly, transformation is achievable with intentional effort, transparency, and a commitment to building trust and collaboration. Now, I've just given you a 10-chapter book in 20 minutes, 18 minutes, and I'm going to now hand over to Rob for some questions that hopefully will be not too taxing for my brain and not too long to answer. I'm pleading evening time here.
Brilliant.
Rob, over to you for some questions. I haven't been looking at the
No,
chat.
that's fine. That's fine. There's been lots of conversation, lots of shock at some of the examples. I think there's probably a few people thinking, my goodness, I'm so grateful that the problem that I'm dealing with at the moment isn't as bad as the one that Martin's just shared. And there's a few people also probably thinking, oh my goodness, I hope I never have a situation like the one that Martin shared. Do please feel free to put some questions in the chat. Jess has already asked if she can share the link to the book when it becomes available. I'm sure we'll do that in Staying Connected as well. So that would be, and there's some resources going in. Let me just turn to the questions. We did have some questions submitted in advance. I'm going to go to the first one. You kind of touched a little bit on it, but what's the best way to manage out a volunteer, or in this context specifically, a voluntary leader who is resistant to change?
It depends what their resistance is. And the first thing I think is to recognize the problem.
Yeah.
So what are they resisting and why are they resisting? And often there's reasons for that. So are they resisting logging on via the internet, and that's just a quiet protest, or are they actually resisting a complete change and are leading a group of volunteers against that change? So the first thing I think is to recognize the problem. The second is obviously to have a conversation with that person and to find out what's going on. So for example, I was working with some warehouse volunteers and we introduced a new computerized system. And that was when we discovered that one of our most resistant volunteers was actually illiterate. They couldn't read, so they couldn't actually log into the system. So we actually sat down with that volunteer and found a different way around that to keep their dignity in that situation. However, if they are actually somebody who is actually no longer a fit for the organization, then I would actually start a process of helping that person move out. And that would either be a voluntary process where you assist the person and you say, I don't think it's appropriate for you to be here anymore, or it's an active process where you say to this person, you've actually breached our volunteer agreement, or you've breached our volunteer code of conduct, or you've breached our volunteer standards. These are the places that we've done it. It's really important that we document this these days because there's legal action that could be at risk. So we document this process. We get assistance for this process from someone else within the organization, but we actually follow it through. We have to help that person move to a new place because of their active resistance. But you know, the first stage is always get the information first, understand what's really going on, and then the last thing is to be honest with other volunteers. Often, you know, a volunteer disappears and you don't explain to people that there was a process followed, and rumors begin. I actually have bearing in mind confidentiality, but I have a process where I say to people, yes, we did follow a process with this volunteer.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting, and you kind of touched on it there, and you touched on it in your presentation as well, and I certainly see it in the work that I do, is the first time that these issues tend to come up is when there's a problem. And rather than people starting to preempt that by having the right kinds of systems and processes in place to deal with them beforehand and make sure everybody understands those. And one of the classics, and I would ask you about this, is as a volunteer manager, quite often, even if you've got the systems and processes, you can come to what is a fair and equitable resolution. at which point the volunteer does an end run round to the chief exec or the chair of the board and says, I don't agree with this outcome, and the chief exec and the chair of the board, who haven't been involved in the process, pull the rug from under the volunteer manager. How
Correct.
do we, as volunteer managers, as volunteer engagement professionals in our organisations, try and prevent that from happening?
I think that we need to make sure that we are actually building relationships up with our chief executives all the time and selling the impact of our volunteering to people so they understand. We need to be ensuring that our policies are integrated into the whole organisation. They're not just isolated policies sitting in volunteer manager land, that they're policies that people understand. I'm a great believer if there's a risk situation that you do tell at least your manager or you tell other people. So if there's a risk that someone could actually pull the rug from under your feet, building trust in your processes so you communicate continually to the management and the executive about your processes is really important. Can I just say, I've been managing volunteers for 125 years now, and I currently manage volunteers for a small program as a volunteer manager. I've now managed probably close to 25,000 volunteers in my life, maybe more. One day I'll add it up. In that time, I have sacked 8 volunteers. And out of that 8, 1 took action against the organisation, because we actually built in systems and processes to make sure that we helped volunteers leave before we got to the point of sacking them. I just want to say 2 things that I'm a big believer in. I went to the Great Canal Trust, and I've probably got the name wrong, workshop. And we talked about surveys. I'm a great believer in getting volunteers to complete surveys every year and to listen to their feedback from that. But another thing that I do, and I've always had a group of volunteers that do it for me, is I actually contact every volunteer every year to find out their experience. And it's often that point you start to find out that a volunteer is moving from an enthusiastic volunteer to the beginning of a volunteer from hell. And that's when you can actually start to do an active intervention with that particular volunteer.
We've got a couple of questions in the chat, but I also just want to check, because we are slightly over time and eating into people's
Sorry,
breaks.
everyone. We did start late.
Not a problem at all. I would suggest we go into the break, but Martin, if you're happy, Sarah and Adam have just put a couple of questions in the chat. If you'd be happy just to ping a quick response to those in the chat whilst everybody goes to the break, that would be awesome.
Sure.
And we're already
Thanks,
getting
Danielle.
how helpful that was.
Please do send me emails if I can be of help, or contact me on LinkedIn.
Brilliant. And we are going to make Martin's slides available to everybody as well, so that you've got them.
Yes, my only request is if you sell them for a large amount of money, please send me half.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Martin. Thank you very much, everybody, for taking part in that. I think I'm handing back to Matt, who's going to usher you off into your breaks.